remembered the first time I met Wilma, which was actually here at the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee. Do you remember when she came in with Gloria Steinem and Mary Frances Berry and so forth? And there was a dinner here, and we all got to, it was a very glamorous evening for us. And I remember driving Wilma around Milwaukee. And when she found out I was from Red Lake, so I'm from Red Lake in northern Minnesota, she told me the story of when she became principal chief, and the first visit she made to another tribal chairman was to visit our tribal chairman at Red Lake, Roger Jordan, who had been for many, many years. I mean, I was born in '59. I hate to say that now. I know I look so youthful. But I think that was the year he was elected tribal chairman. So I never really knew any other tribal chairman. You know, it was just he was there for decades, for a very long time. So Wilma went to visit Roger Jordan, and I was really impressed because she came from Oklahoma in January to northern Minnesota, so I thought she's a brave person. But she said that when she came to Red Lake, Roger gave her the things, right? Walleye, wild rice, and a jingle dress. And I thought how appropriate a gift that was to give to Wilma. And so I decided to call my talk at the University of Oklahoma Wilma's Jingle Dress. And some of that has to do with the fact that, you know, the jingle dress has strong associations for Ojibwe people with healing, has a strong therapeutic value. And so, and Wilma has struggled in her life with many problems. She had a kind of a chronic neuromuscular condition. She had various problems, health problems, but she was someone who was never, like a sick person. She was someone who had this incredible energy, this incredible vitality, this great force about her. And so I kind of started thinking about the jingle dress and the longer history, and I wanted to talk about Ojibwe women's work in healing, kind of to honor her. So that's the origins of this. Since then, I've been thinking a little bit more about the jingle dress. And so what I'd like to talk about today is its connection to the World War I era. And I was telling Kim how I've been talking the last couple of days with a wonderful writer that we just had at the University of Minnesota, Joseph Boyden, who wrote this novel that I think is like a masterpiece, really, this novel, 3-Day Road, which is about two Cree guys fighting in the trenches of Belgium during World War I. And the story moves back and forth between kind of their lives in rural Ontario and the war in Europe. And so, I don't know what it is, something about this period where a lot of Native historians and writers have been kind of focused on World War II. Now we've kind of gone back and are looking at, the meaning of that period in kind of American Indian history. And what I'm going to talk about in particular is how I think it relates to that era of the lives of Ojibwe women. So I'm going to just kind of start out and read a little bit then. Anthropologists Patricia Albers and Beatrice Medicine witnessed the, quote, sudden explosion and spread of jingle dresses and dancing that took place on the powwow circuit in the 1980s. In fact, they cited the jingle dress trend as one reason it is challenging for scholars to write about the powwow, which is, in their words, an ever-changing and expanding world with both enormous changes as well as persisting traditions. Tara Browner, an ethnomusicologist of Choctaw ancestry, wrote about her own experience of being a jingle dress dancer on the powwow circuit for 7 years in her study, Heartbeat of the People. Browner wrote about the reverence she has for the ever-unfolding jingle dress dance tradition. And she said, the very act of dancing in this dress constitutes a prayer for healing, and often spectators, musicians, and other dancers will make gifts of tobacco to the dancer and request that she pray for an ill family member while she dances. An example of hidden spirituality and ritual within a public forum, the ever-unfolding story of the jingle dress dance is unique in Indian country. So scholars have viewed the jingle dress as an ever-unfolding movement in the ever-changing way American Indians create and adapt the powwow to new circumstances. As Albers and Medicine have explained, songs, styles of singing and dancing, and regalia designs unique to particular tribes and regions are now crossing cultural boundaries more and more often. So many American Indian people appreciate the jingle dress dance tradition as a prayer of healing, and its widespread adoption by other tribal women, especially since the 1980s, suggests that people from all over Native North America find power and meaning in its ceremonial performance. But the jingle dress is an Ojibwe tradition that began in the early 20th century, but one with enduring significance. Its introduction rallied a communal spirit among Ojibwe people, a spirit that sustains people of diverse cultures and tribal backgrounds today. The jingle dress dance began as a creative approach to adversity, illness, and poor health, but with a foundation solidly rooted in traditional Ojibwe song and dance. And what I've been thinking about is that the jingle dress dance arose around the time of World War I, when the Spanish influenza pandemic was a deadly peril, sickening Indians on reservations, children in government boarding schools, as well as, of course, this national, international problem that it was. By the time of the 1918 outbreak, and I'll kind of try to provide evidence for this as I go along this argument, tuberculosis had replaced smallpox as the largest health threat to Indians, and the number of TB patients on reservations, boarding schools, and sanitariums was really multiplying. There were also many other health problems Native people suffered from at the time, including trachoma. Ojibwe women in the early 20th century, perhaps more than ever, found their special knowledge of healing in demand. So Ojibwe people associate the jingle dress with therapeutic rituals that support physical and spiritual healing. And in every part of community and economic life related to the well-being of families and health, Ojibwe women were especially active, and the jingle dress and rituals associated with it part of their legacy. Women demonstrated an extraordinary commitment to good life and health, even during the post-allotment turmoil, through continued dedication to ceremonial life, indigenous forms of healing, and perhaps most dynamically as laborers in the traditional economy. Ojibwe women engaged their changing world straight on. They adapted gender roles and expectations and adjusted labor practices to the new circumstances of the reservation. So a lot of this is kind of, I'm glossing over, but it's sort of what I'm talking about in the book coming out this winter, Ojibwe Women, which is kind of takes a long look at Ojibwe women's history from the time of the fur trade up to activism in Minneapolis. But what I kind of really like to focus on and what has interested me as a scholar is the early 20th century, first with writing about the experiences of Native people in federal boarding schools, and more recently thinking about how men and women's work has changed in the reservation era, and especially in the early 20th century. And I find that the periods like the 1930s are especially significant in some of those transitions. Their vocation women's vocation allowed the most proficient individuals to identify and gather plans for everyday and occasional use for a range of conditions. Women continued to harvest food just as they had in the pre-reservation era. Women worked as the principal harvesters of wild rice in their communities, bringing good health and stability to Ojibwe life in years otherwise notable for land loss, deprivation, and crisis. So what I kind of talk about in the book coming out, which I don't have time to talk about today, is especially in the wild rice economy, men began harvesting wild rice, and what I argue there is it was a transition of the Great Depression. The jingle dress dance flourished under harsh conditions in the Great Lakes, but women applied the ceremony like a salve to fresh wounds. They designed jingle dresses, organized sodalities, and danced at tribal gatherings large and intimate, spreading a new tradition while participating in innovative rituals of healing, nurturing the body and spirit with food, medicines, and dance. In the midst of the post-allotment turmoil, as people looked for ways to reorder their chaotic worlds, the jingle dress dance was dream-given to the Ojibwe people. So, as I mentioned, the jingle dress dance first appeared around the time of World War I. Special healing songs are associated with the dress, and the songs and the dresses possess a strong therapeutic value. Women who participate in the jingle dress dance and wear these special dresses do so to ensure the health and well-being of an individual, family, or even the broader tribal community. And the jingle dress is a frequent theme of storytelling, even contemporary storytelling among Ojibwe people, and one narrative in particular addresses its origin. Now, I don't know what some of you other folks have heard, or Diane probably has stories that she's heard about the origin of the jingle dress, but this is the one that I have heard most often in Red Lake. The setting for the story is sometimes in the Mille Lacs Ojibwe community in north central Minnesota. At other times, I have heard the same story as talked about originating in Whitefish Bay, Ontario, so somewhat farther north. Both of these communities express a very strong tradition of Ojibwe, song and dance, and in fact there is great interaction among these communities here in the Great Lakes. But the following story is the one I first heard about the origin of the Jingle Dress dance. So what I'm bringing to this is, usually it's not associated that I've heard it with a particular time when the story's told. But what I believe is around the time of World War I, perhaps as a result of the widespread epidemic of Spanish influenza, an Ojibwe girl became very sick. Her father, fearing the worst, sought a vision to save her life and learned of a unique dress and dance. The father made this dress for his daughter and asked her to dance in this kind of spring-like steps in which one foot is never to leave the ground. Before long, as the story goes, she felt stronger and continued the dance. And after her recovery, she continued to dance in this special dress and eventually formed the first Jingle Dress Dance Society. So, Ojibwe narratives suggest that a man conceived the Jingle Dress dance after receiving a vision, though women were responsible for its proliferation. And the very first Jingle Dress dancer was a young girl, yet females of all ages, from youths to elders, historically embraced the tradition. So, anyway, that is the story that I kind of have heard most frequently, kind of in northern Minnesota, about the origin of the Jingle Dress. And I always think about, how this story, it sounds like when people have the flu, not even like the H1N1 or the Spanish influenza, these devastating kinds of illnesses, but when you have the flu, it's like you think you're going to die, right? And then one day, all of a sudden you want breakfast, or, it just, and so the story always reminds me of someone kind of like, I guess things are gonna be okay and I feel good. But the Jingle Dress dance coincided its origin with a new round of suppression of Indian religion in the United States as the dance order from Washington arrived in 1921. And it's sort of kind of famously talked about, among historians and thinking about federal policy changes in the early 20th century about how this last sort of gasp of the assimilation movement comes out in the early 1920s from the Indian office, banning ritualistic dances in the forms of powwows and other sorts of things. There's little doubt that Ojibwe women completely disregarded the new ruling because historic photographs show them in jingle dresses from around 1920, and often photographs, postcards, and such are dated circa 1920, right? And every decade thereafter, first on reservations and then later in the cities. When the Jingle Dress dance was introduced, or the dress was introduced, it was an innovation, but one consistent with Ojibwe's spiritual practices and traditions of song and dance. So, since World War I, the tradition, despite the ban on, from the Indian office, the ban on ritualistic dance, the tradition spread throughout Ojibwe country and very soon reached Dakota people as well. So, again, Jingle Dress dancing is important to Ojibwe people because of its associations with healing. In the Ojibwe world, spiritual power moves through air, and sounds hold great significance. And so the Jingle Dress is special because of these rows of oh, I have to go through the ritual, I forget about this. Because of the rows of metal cones that dangle from the garment's fabric to produce, as we all know, this really lovely dissonant rattle when they bounced against one another. The effect is amazing when men and women dance together. When the jingle dresses first appeared, they resembled women's ceremonial dresses of the era. But of course, innovation is always part of powwow and dance regalia, and the jingle dress is no exception. But the dresses through the decades share many common features. So this dress is actually one that's in the collection of the Minnesota Historical Society in St. Paul. and it dates from the early 20th century. It's designed by Mary Bigwin of White Earth, and the jingle dress belonged to her granddaughter, Madeline, when she was a teenager. So the dress over here in the display case is a sleeveless black velvet. I feel like I'm doing a fashion show. It's a sleeveless black velvet dress with an empire waist. A single line of jingles is in each row at the bodice, hip, knee, and hemline. And the jingles are fashioned, of course, with the round snuff can lids pressed into the distinctive shape of a cone. Dancers often completed their ensemble with a belt. My grandmother and older women at Red Lake wore rather simple jingle dresses at powwows some 50 years after its introduction, well before this great jingle dress dance revival that began in the 1980s, when interest in the dress grew along with the contest powwow and the expansion of the northern and southern powwow circuits. The jingle dress evolved into a stylish, elaborate, pan-Indian phenomenon, but for Ojibwe people, it persists as a ceremonial dress with specific cultural associations. For the purpose of the exhibit, this was an exhibit actually of Ojibwe photographs at the Historical Society just a couple of years ago that Carrie may have seen and certainly knows Bruce White's book of photographs. But so the dress is placed next to this really lovely photograph of Margaret Fine from Huntsford at White Earth, which was taken by a Minnesota photographer named Monroe Keeley. And I think it's a 1946 photo of Margaret Fine. And he has a vast collection of photographs of Ojibwe people in the collections of the Historical Society. And if you ever want to look at interesting images of Ojibwe people, the Historical Society in Minnesota has a lot of these just on their digital resources database, and you can just kind of click on and put in jingle dress or something and see what comes up, or wild rice, White Earth, whatever it is you like. And I always find his photographs really interesting because he was not a professional photographer, but like a lot of people in the summer in Minnesota or Wisconsin, head up north, right? And the Indians are interesting and want to go see what they're up to. And he happened to work for Eastman Kodak and had access to color photography earlier than most of us. And so when you see his photographs from like before World War II, often they are color photographs, and they look like, to me, except for the clothes, something like the 70s or that sort of thing. And he also has some wonderful film footage that he has of folks ricing people in maple sugar camp around the Mille Lacs area. That's really lovely. And he lived to be like 102 or something. He passed away this past year. So what I wanted to do then, after I began thinking about the idea, of the jingle dress kind of emerging around the time of World War II, World War I, is that I just wanted to kind of spend some time looking at all the images I could find of Ojibwe women in jingle dresses. And so I went through the collections at the Historical Society and spent a lot of happy time doing that. And then I have my wonderful colleague at the University of Minnesota, Pat Albers, who I like to put my hat off to Pat Albers in Milwaukee because she grew up in Milwaukee. And she's now kind of on phased retirement. She's had a wonderful, distinguished career as one of the first scholars to write about American Indian women. But she has this amazing personal collection of postcards and especially focusing on Great Lakes Indian people. And she has been collecting postcards like this since she was a girl growing up in Milwaukee. And so when you go to Pat's house, she is like, has file cabinets, like going into an old-fashioned library or something, all these wonderful file cabinets. Every postcard is in a sleeve, and she has this amazing collection of postcards. And so about a year and a half ago, Pat and I just kind of decided, because she became interested in, well, I wonder if it is, World War I or the Spanish influenza. So we spent some time looking at her remarkable collection of postcards and at hundreds of images of Ojibwe people in Wisconsin and in Minnesota from the early 20th century, with the idea kind of testing this idea out. Did the jingle dress come around the time of 1920 and the flu epidemic? And again, I said I'd already looked, at the images from the Historical Society. But what I learned from Pat is that photographs on postcards can be dated fairly easily. And not only by their postmarks, which to me was the only way I had of dating them, right, being a real not too savvy there. But she talked about you have to understand the formats that are used in printing. And in the case of postcards on which real photographs were printed, and if you see old postcards, they're often, photographs. The style, she said, of the stamp boxes, so this is a place where you would put your stamp on a postcard, changed at fairly regular intervals from 1900 to 1960. And so that is how you can actually date the photographs, right? So she tells me, for example, postcards that have an AZO stamp box where the arrows point upwards were produced between 1915 and 1922, right? That's the kind of period I'm looking for. While those with an AZO and squares at each corner appear from about 1921 to 1930. So, and I'm sorry, I said I brought my wrong PowerPoint. I can't even do technology. I bring the wrong PowerPoint when I come someplace. But I had some of the postcards on a different PowerPoint. But anyway, so I'm not going to be able to show you those. So you just have to believe me about all this stuff about the stamp boxes. There are a few caveats Pat tells me to keep in mind when following these sorts of markings to date postcard pictures. One important one is that popular photos were often printed on postcards long after, of course, the pictures were taken. As a result, one has to kind of have other information, stamp boxes, other things to contextualize the picture and confirm the kind of approximate date of its original making. And what we figured out then, looking at her large collection of, and organized by community, right, in her wonderful file cabinets, we really weren't able to find a postcard from Minnesota that pictured a jingle dress in a photograph before 1920. Confirming, I think, my thought that the dress and its dance might have been a creative innovation in the wake of the 1918-1919 influenza pandemic. So what we see is kind of in the decade after then, circa 1920, jingle dresses are the most prominent regalia Ojibwe women are seen wearing on postcards from Minnesota. And what we see by kind of about 1930 then, looking at her wonderful collection, is that jingle dresses are seen on postcards from all regions of Minnesota in the following decade. And so we look at Cass Lake, Peanut, all these places, and we start to see kind of the movement, right, of jingle dresses. Looking at postcards from the 1930s, we start to see women attired in jingle dresses from South Dakota and North Dakota. And some of the women pictured in those photographs are Dakota women from, what we used to call Fort Taunton, the Spirit Lake community over in North Dakota. And we believe that they often, because again of the stories that we've heard from those communities, and especially Pat's long history of field work over there, that many of the people, when Pat was doing field work in the 1960s, right, as a young anthropologist over at Fort Taunton, that many of the women in the community talked about the fact that they acquired their jingle dresses from Ojibwe women from Red Lake and northern Minnesota, and they were often being passed down, first given as gifts from special friends at Red Lake and White Earth, and then and dresses are often passed down for a very, very long time. And then, sort of as time goes on, you start to see too jingle dresses appearing, north of Red Lake, the Rainy Lake, Rainy River regions along the borders with Canada. The styles of early jingle dresses followed those popular at the time, and if you look at women in photographs, you see that they wear, styles of dresses that are popular in the day. And so many of these early jingle dress dances featured a broad sailor-like collar. And so that was something that was kind of popular at that time. And kind of a loose fitting garment, almost like a flapper style dress, is what we see in a lot of these early images of postcards and photographs from places like Mille Lacs. Later on in the 1940s, you start to see, and again, I didn't bring these postcards, but you start to see more fitted dresses in the 1940s, kind of around the World War II era. Over time, when we looked at postcards, we found a whole variety of creative embellishments associated with the dresses, including floral beadwork applique combined with jingles. And this you start to see in the 1930s in places like Cass Lake and that in other places in northern Minnesota. Sometimes even very beautiful little pearl buttons that are embellishments on these jingle dresses in the 30s, 1940s, and later. So now, I guess, maybe if I were from Whitefish Bay, I would try to make a real strong argument that this is where it emerged and go look at a whole nother set, of photographs, images, and postcards. But it seems like, consistent with Ojibwe stories from Minnesota, the visual evidence for the history of the jingle dress indicates it most likely emerged somewhere in northwest central Minnesota, perhaps the Mille Lacs area, as the stories go, in between, that era around, I would just say kind of around 1920, because this is where the earliest and the largest concentration of postcard pictures appear. Now I would say, just as kind of Pat one of the things she wanted to check out was that she remembers jingle-like things on dresses, especially from Wisconsin Ojibwe people earlier in the century. And so we kind of looked at what those jingle things looked like on dresses in the early 20th century. So Ojibwe people are sometimes, men and women, are pictured in jingles of some kind before 1920. And there is an early postcard from the early 20th century which shows a man from Leech Lake, someone from northern Minnesota, wearing a great necklace of spent ammunition casings, which have a jingle-like quality. And I always think that's quite a statement, right? Quite a powerful fashion statement. So you sometimes see, jingle things, right, on Ojibwe men and women's clothing. The use of shell, bone, copper, and in post-contact times, other metal, tinkly things do adorn regalia. And this has a long and documented history in the upper Midwest. So we shouldn't be surprised to see tinklers like this on regalia pictured on postcards produced before World War I. But what I like to say is that the use of metal cones to trim regalia does not by itself make a garment a jingle dress, right? And this is what seems to be emerging around the time of the First World War. So the visual evidence that we could kind of come across suggests that the one-piece dress first emerged in Minnesota, and it did so very shortly after the influenza pandemic of 1918. So let me just kind of, I know this is not a peak time of day for listening to historians, and so I'm just going to kind of wrap it up by saying a couple of things about Frances Densmore and some of the work that she did, just in a very brief conclusion. So Frances Densmore, the Minnesota ethnomusicologist, visited what she kind of regarded at the time as the most remote of all the Minnesota Indian communities in 1918, which is up on the Red Lake Reservation, the town of Panema. Panema rises from the water at the point where the upper and lower portions of Red Lake join, forming a vast freshwater lake in northern Minnesota. Panema was only accessible by water or by crossing over the frozen ice in winter. Densmore, inspired by the dynamic traditions of Ojibwe music she discovered there, recorded many songs that deeply influenced her ideas about American Indian music and its relationship to healing and medicine. She later wrote about the community of Panema. She said, Most of the Indians are members of the Bidewawin, and its rites are closely observed. After visiting Panema, Densmore consistently underscored in her writings and lectures that Ojibwe people believe in what she called the healing power of music. Densmore came to regard her Ojibwe informants, in her words, as primitive psychologists, which I always try to take as a compliment. Because of their ability to harness the spiritual energy of song for emotional health, Densmore understood that health and long life represented the highest good to the mind of a Chippewa, and he who had, quoting her, he who had knowledge conducive to that end was the most highly esteemed among them. On a series of WCCO radio shows in Minneapolis during the 1930s, Densmore introduced Minnesotans to aspects of Dakota and Ojibwe culture they might not otherwise experience. She emphasized music, healing traditions, and plant knowledge, while explaining that work like gathering medicines was gender-neutral labor in Ojibwe culture. And she said on the radio, all summer the old medicine men and women were gathering and drying herbs so they would have a good supply of medicines and remedies of all sorts. So now it's well after a century since Densmore embarked on her important fieldwork among Ojibwe people. But interest in Ojibwe and native landscapes and the environment and traditions of indigenous healing have never really been greater. Indigenous people throughout North America and the world are remembering their traditional diets, activities, and medicines, along with linguistic and cultural revitalizations. The healing power of music is no longer a belief confined to American Indians in the U.S. and Canada. The Ojibwe Jingle dress dance did not disappear, but instead, during the 1980s, it made a great leap as it evolved from a regional tradition practiced by small numbers of elderly women, like my grandmother, to a flourishing tribal performance with wide appeal across the generations. And it has maintained its integrity as a dance of healing. So the jingle dress, a gift of healing from the Ojibwe people, has adapted, survived, and continues to inspire American Indian women and their communities.
Does anybody have any questions that you would like to ask Brenda?
How long did it take you to research for this book?
Don't ask a historian that. I don't know, because this book, the Ojibwe Women book that's coming out in the winter, is a new series of American Indian history from Penguin. It's like this special kind of series, and a book just came out in the series Jeff Osler did called The Lakota and the Black Hills. And I wasn't really thinking about writing a book about Ojibwe women over time, right? The fur trade, I think, what do I know about the fur trade? I always kind of say these things to myself. So it was sort of a suggestion, you know, on the part of this editorial group, which is Bill Deloria, Colin Calloway, Fred Hoxie, and so forth, and the editor, who wanted a book in the series about women, and there I was on the editorial board, so we decided, gee, let's do Ojibwe women, that would be so great. So I've been working on this for, I knew I was going to do it, and then I kind of wrote the first manuscript. I finished it, the first draft of the manuscript 2 years ago, and then they take a little while, the editor comes back, this is what they want you to do to change it. And it came at a moment when I was in the middle of the semester, in the middle of the year, and I couldn't really, write. It was just not what I was going to be doing then. And so it took me till this summer to return to it. And so what I wanted to do when I had this kind of first draft, I wanted to kind of go back and look at it because I felt like I wanted to add more documents, more Ojibwe women's voices to the whole manuscript. I was kind of pleased with, the organization and all that, but I felt like that needed it. And so I kind of went and looked at some of the documents that I didn't know that well before, like the WPA narratives from Wisconsin with Ojibwe people that were done in the 1930s. Many of them were done with very elderly people, and elderly women in the 1930s. And I just, when I went and looked at those again, I saw that they were talking about wild ricing, and they were telling these great stories. And while they might be asking them about wild ricing or how you made a living, they were talking about their husbands and their children and their marriages, right? And so I just found that this was really a really rich body of material. And so I tried to go back and introduce this and tell some stories at the beginnings of chapters, you know, that were, I thought, people telling their life story or their voices. And so that's sort of what I've been, you know, kind of involved in. So I heard from the editor like 2 days ago, and he said, great, you know, I'm sending you back. He's, you know, someone in New York. It's not like when you do something with the university presses where you have, you know, historians and they just care about your argument and your footnotes. And, you know, the people in New York want you to tell a story and have it be in Barnes and Noble kind of thing. And so their interests are a little bit different. But what I was saying to Jacqueline, I think today, is what I like about the book is that when these books come out with Penguin, they come out in hardback for $22, and they come out then in a nice Penguin paperback for $14. And I really like that because, as Mary and others know, academic books can be very expensive, and sometimes just, you know, you can only be in a conversation with other historians and that sort of thing. So I hope it's, you know, but anyway, it's been in the work for a while. It's supposed to be coming out in the winter. But
could you tell us the title of that?
it's called Ojibwe Women and the Survival of Indian Community, and that was their idea, like the survival. I mean, I'm fine because it's all about community the whole way through. Yeah.
I kind of have a traditional question on Native American
Sure.
regalia. When you want to obtain let's say a jingle dress,
Right.
I know in just hearing from my elders that
Sure.
that's nothing that you purchase. It's always something that it's either handmade by another elder, or it's either a gift, or what is the actual background on that? I mean, is there a history on that? I mean, I'm sure you could probably, I mean, we're World Wide Web now. I'm sure you can go online and
Get one on eBay. You can
Right,
get one
but
on
I
eBay.
mean, to get the traditional feel of that, and what really is the, well, I don't want to say there are no rules, but I mean, traditionally.
The protocol.
Yes,
Jingle
exactly.
dresses.
Is that something that you would request from an elder, or was that
Yeah.
someone that you would request from your tribal members?
That's a great question, and I don't want to be the only one to try to answer that question, so.
Depends on what tribe you are, because different tribes have different beliefs.
Right, well, I'm Ojibwe, and I mean, I own no regalia other than
Yeah.
things that I've obtained, moccasins from my grandmother, but I have, you know, nieces and nephews that would love to participate, but I just know that's something that is very spiritual, that you really wouldn't want something so commercialized as well, but I just wanted, I've never known the answer to that question.
I can say just like, like at Warriors, you know, they always have the contest at the annual powwow for the Princess of the Brave, and one of the requirements is that they make their own regalia. So that they learn about it, and they do it step by step, and they can talk about it, so it's not just what it looks like, but they have to be able to talk about it and explain it and so on. Which is really important.
That it'd be more of a handmade.
Yeah, and I mean, different people have other things to say, like I was told that we had to have 365 jingles, one for every day of the year, and I'm telling you, that's really heavy.
Yeah.
And also the jingles are, you know, different kind of jingles, like my first dress, my uncle made every jingle out of either the snuff cans or the tobacco or the Folgers coffee, and that's a lot of work.
It is,
Yeah.
I know, I got my first dress when I was 14, and it was a community effort, and it was so sweet, because one of the women who helped make the dress was a woman who was kind of losing her eyesight, and she helped my mom, and there were all kinds of jingles. I mean, I had, you know, Schlitz beer cans. But I must say, and I want Diane to answer this question too if she feels like it, but I'm in the 70s, right? I was in the 70s, and I did not want to dress like my grandmother.
Right.
You know, we were not into jingle dresses. We wanted buckskin, you know, that sort of thing. So, I mean, my mother really wanted me to have this kind of dress, but I had this other dress, right, which
So,
is the
but did you
fringe and the
have
buckskin.
to make it, or did someone make it for you? Did you?
Someone
purchase
made those
it?
dresses for me, but they were new. But I must say, like, my grandmother was a jingle dress dancer, and this was, so when I was growing up, old ladies, I thought old ladies wore jingle dresses, and they did not have 365 jingles on them because they're, you know, now we have, like, you know how long people spend making their regalia and this kind of thing. I mean, my grandmother would start putting her dress together the week before the powwow. There were no contests at Red Lake back then, you know, or they were small contests. And so they were just there to dance, and you would do, you know, you would just put your dress together. Now there are, when I was a girl, old ladies, strictly over 65 and over, who would wear a jingle dress. And so I think I didn't, you know, my generation at that time, like all these other things you don't appreciate about all the wonderful people in your life, you know. But I do know, you know, in Minnesota, there are some very old dresses still being danced that have been passed down for generations and many years. Yeah. Do you have anything to say, Diane, about, do you think, adhere to the 365 jingles, or?
I heard that story too.
Yeah.
When I was younger, I saw dresses that were like,
Yes.
you were much.
The older ladies found, there was a little, a young girl in the junior princess contest at Red Lake in August, I was noticing, and she had on what I would consider to be she was like 12, right? A very fine, you know, black velvet, minimal jingles, gorgeous floral beadwork. And I would have thought my grandmother's, if you had a really nice dress, those ladies would have had a dress like that. And everybody loved this girl. No leggings, you know, and just moccasins, and that's how women, kind of really nice women, looked in their jingle dresses, I think, in the 60s and 70s. And boy, did people love her, because she looked like the old ladies, and she's 12, and everybody thought that was so wonderful, you know.
What I know about jingle dresses isn't a lot, but there's like two types or two uses, I guess. Some people dance at powwows with jingle dresses, and some women only dance in a spiritual sense, only for healing. And I know a little bit more about that. And in that case, the dress, they say when you wear that dress, it's like, you know, really the church is a temple or something like that. What's it they say about that dress? That once you put that on, you are spiritual, and you are carrying that spiritual power, which is healing. And it's really, we've been in, Carrie's been in too, we've been in jingle dress ceremonies, and it's very different than when we go to a powwow.
Very different.
And it's very powerful.
Do they have anything like that locally occasionally, or is that locally meaning?
Locally, we can reach
Regionally.
20 miles away, you can.
Yeah, or let's say in our Midwest region.
In the state, yes,
In our
in Milwaukee, not so much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing that I kind of was thinking of, if I had my other thing, my real nice PowerPoint, not just those few images I threw up today, but I was sort of interested, you know, we had this terrible event in Red Lake a few years back, this school shooting. And we, you know, everybody in the community was affected by that in some way or another. One of my cousins was shot, and was one of the young people who was shot. He was shot in the chest, survived, like, out of the hospital, you know, that week. And so we felt very fortunate about that, but that has had a really big impact on the community. And what I wanted to kind of think about with this too, it's not just to say, oh, Ojibwe women are so great because we did this and everybody has copied us, you know, but it's to say how much meaning this could continue to have. And it doesn't matter if it originated at Mille Lacs, you know, or Whitefish Bay, it's just how powerful this has been for Ojibwe people, and how it had a certain kind of meaning, I think, at its origin in around the time of World War I. Probably had different kinds of associations, maybe for my grandmother and her generation, and then how it became this huge pan-Indian thing in the post-1980s era, and how it has had a renewed significance for people across North America, and that's just kind of an amazing thing to me. And so I was, one of the young girls who was in the high school two sisters who are friends of our family were in the high school during the shooting. One of them helped save my young cousin's life, and she became the princess at the powwow at Red Lake 3 years ago. And she decided that, she graduated from high school. Didn't want to go back to Red Lake, didn't want to go back to high school. Her sister dropped out of high school and has never finished yet, her younger sister. But this young woman, Danny, wanted to graduate, so she went away, came back, and now she's in college out at Hampshire College in Massachusetts. They gave her a full ride scholarship, and she's just an amazing young woman. My brother always says she's not a res girl because she's a vegetarian. But Danny, this was, of course, as anybody, a very traumatic event. And so part of her healing was to make her own jingle dress dance the year that she was the princess at Red Lake. And the dress that she made, and she's a very individual person. It wasn't like, she dances in a style, but she had these green she's funky, she's a funky girl. And she had these beautiful green organza sleeves, and she just has a beautiful artistic eye. And the other, at Red Lake, I don't know if they have to make the complete regalia for the next princess. They have to be the crown. And you know how those crowns have gotten to be as big as the Pope's?
Yeah.
And so the year, Danny's wasn't so much big, the one she made for the girl next year, but it was so stunning. It was just it was almost like a retro and super cool powwow princess crown. It was just really neat. So I always kind of think of her and what it has meant, not just what it meant in 1918, but how it's such a powerful thing for people today, and how helpful and how therapeutic it can be for Ojibwe people, and how for generations and generations it can find new meanings, right? And so that's what's really great about Ojibwe people. So.
I actually, I did my master's thesis on the jingle dress, and
So do you agree, or?
well, I was in religious studies then, so I was looking at it from a different angle. But I did a lot of oral interviews across Upper Michigan, and one of the things or the pieces that I would add to this is a lot of the women there that were dancing it talked about that you either were called to the dance in a dream or went out fasting to ask permission to make the dress and dance in. So that was a piece that they added, and whether that's regional or not, I couldn't say because I didn't do any interviews over in Minnesota. But that's a belief that they hold in that region about it.
So I feel like in our family, I don't know if your daughter, does she have a jingle? Renee, our daughter does too, will be 10 on Saturday. And Danny, the princess, gave her the new dress. She had one made, and then she has this little dress that's been passed on from our friend Danny. And, but it has skipped a couple of generations because it's my grandma, Jeanette Oganash, down to my daughter Renee. Either my mother and I both danced at powwows, but not really as jingle dress dancers. Well, thank you so much for turning out. Now it's like dark out.